scripture reading this morning is Exodus 17, 1 through 7. In your pew Bibles, it's on page 59. Let's read. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped in Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock of Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders and of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning again. I'm finally seeing all of you, so good morning. It's good to see you guys. I'm really thankful to be here, thankful for the invite to preach, and for your support and encouragement, for your prayers, for sending us to Chicago back in June of last year. It's 2025. That's hard to believe. It's been over 6 months since we moved our family to Chicago. We're loving Chicago. Summer was the right time to move to Chicago. So we got to get out in our neighborhood and walk and go on the trails and the local coffee shops and meet some of our neighbors. I haven't seen one of our neighbors in like 6 weeks because you just stay inside, and then you walk from inside to your garage and you get in your car. So it's a real dynamic. Summertime was a great time to meet some people. I have my neighbor's phone number so we can chat. I don't have to meet him in the backyard when it's 5 degrees outside. So this is our family. I think I have a picture of us. The girls send their greetings from Chicago. My wife, Emily, and then Ella's our oldest there in the middle, Eva on the right, and Amelia on the left. So they're a little bigger even than the last time you saw us, probably. I'll tell a quick story about us that maybe typifies our time in Chicago so far. One evening, we were getting ready for dinner. It's 20 minutes to dinner, stuff is on the stove. It's summertime, and we've got a big back porch, and our neighbor moved out this summer, so we have a double big back porch. And so we take the girls out on the porch, and we play there all the time, and our back door has a different knob on the bottom than the top, so the deadbolt is different than the doorknob, so we never lock the doorknob, and it's one of those push doorknobs. One of our girls very enthusiastically opens the door and then shuts the door behind her. And when she opened the door, she pushed the pin of the lock, to which we have no key. So we find ourselves on the porch. Thankfully, it's summertime, so we're not dying of exposure. But it was a moment of panic a little bit. All right, I can see the pot boiling on the stove through the window. We're locked out here. I know my neighbor's phone number, so I can text Rogelio and maybe get in the front door, but I can't get into my apartment to get this sorted out. And my wife is just it's no problem. She pulls out her phone, she pulls out a credit card, and she just goes and starts jimmying the lock to the door, which, as she succeeded, much to my doubt, made me feel more confident in the deadbolt and less confident in the doorknob. So just an example of the resiliency of my wife, some problem solving, working together as a family, probably typifies my cynical, complaining attitude when we hit a problem. And also our neighbors. I texted Rogelio like, hey, we're locked out. And he just replied, ha 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 ha. So we moved to Chicago to plant a church. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that, and then we're going to jump back into the text. So Chicago, boom. It is a big city, the third largest city in the U.S. About 3 million people live in the city proper of Chicago and 9 million more in the surrounding suburbs. Of those 9 million people, only 3% would say that they're followers of Jesus. 3%. 22% would identify with no religious affiliation. And if we look kind of more macro across the entire United States, the largest growing religious demographic in our country is those who identify with no religion. So the 3% trend is not necessarily on its way up. And so we felt a burden for the city of Chicago, a call from God to go there as a family to share the good news of Jesus with our neighbors, with a city that needs him, and to do so in partnership with existing local churches that are living on mission, living faithfully, sharing the gospel. Can I get the next slide? Chicago is also an incredibly diverse city. So you can see, actually the US Census Bureau projects that in the United States, by 2040, there will be no majority ethnic population. So Chicago is already reflecting where the country is going, and we see this incredible opportunity to live on mission among a diverse set of neighbors that are coming from other nations, that are coming from other parts of the country, maybe some who for generations have called Chicago home. And we want to bring a message of reconciliation and hope through the person and work of Christ in that place. And more specifically, as we've been on the ground over the past 6 months praying with our partner church, Chicago West Bible Church, we've felt an increased burden for the south side of Chicago. Chicago West is on the west side of Chicago, in a neighborhood called Austin in this city. And for years, they have been praying for a south side neighborhood called Bronzeville, that God would birth a new gospel work there, that they would encourage local churches there. And so as we got on the ground and prayed together with our friends at Chicago West, we started to share that burden, to go to the south side, to make Jesus known, to make him visible in the neighborhood. Not because there aren't any existing local churches there that are living faithfully, but because there's so many lost people who don't know the Lord. And so, next slide. A little bit about Bronzeville. Bronzeville is home to tons of music and artists, business people, creatives. It's also this whole area of the south side that we're seeking to engage. Next slide. Is also home to a lot of historic landmarks and beauty in the city. So on the left is the Museum of Science and Industry. It's the last remaining building from the Chicago World's Fair at the turn of the century, last century. And then on the right is the University of Chicago. Next, it's also incredibly diverse. You've got like the White Sox Stadium, you have Chinatown, you have Little Mexico, there's tons of authentic soul food in the neighborhood. And so you have this amazing mesh of cultures and people, but unfortunately Chicago is actually quite segregated. For all of its diversity, people tend to just group up by cultural similarity or sometimes language similarity, like for immigrant groups as they come into the city. It makes sense to get around people who know your language and can help you navigate being in the city. But this kind of pervades all of society: work, school, homes, business places, and entire neighborhoods, and unfortunately churches. And so we also feel a burden from God to be a part of planting a multi-ethnic, multicultural, even multi-socioeconomic church in the city that would reconcile people and help us to live together, because we think that actually living in multi-ethnic community shapes and forms us in the way that God wants us to, in the way that reflects the kingdom and where we're headed. Revelation 7:9 tells us that all people will gather around the throne, all languages and tribes and people. And so we want to be an outpost of that on Sunday morning and throughout the week, living on mission together, in all the good and bad and ugly of that as we learn to navigate cultural differences and learn from one another. Kind of where we are in the process right now, our mission is to make disciples who love God, love people, and seek the good of the city. And then our vision is to see a community renewed by life with Jesus. We believe as people encounter Jesus and spend time with him in community, we are transformed, they are transformed, and then even like our homes and our neighborhoods and eventually a city is impacted by the gospel. But how we do that is initially just by listening and learning from our neighbors. We can't possibly hope to tell them about the good news unless we know the story they're living in and how the gospel impacts where they're at. So we want to engage the city then to love and to serve as Jesus modeled for us, and then to tell them the good news that the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. From that, make disciples who love God, love people, and seek the good of the city, and then we are praying that God would birth a church out of that. So we're kind of in the middle space here where we're inviting people to jump in with us. I'd invite you to join us by praying for us, by giving, and even by going, whether that's talking with me afterwards. Hey, as you were talking about Chicago, I feel drawn to join in God's mission there, or in upcoming short-term trips to keep this partnership alive. This family and you all have shaped me to live on mission in Chicago, and I'm grateful. And I would love, let's get in together and get our hands messy, serving and loving the city together. So, a quick Chicago story. Do any of you know the story of the reversal of the Chicago River? So if you think about the geography of Chicago, you've got this really big city right on the edge of Lake Michigan, and the Chicago River runs into Lake Michigan. So all the people and all of their garbage and stuff goes into the river, and then it flows into the lake. And then you draw water from the lake to drink, which is a problem, a water problem. So the Army Corps of Engineers devised this plan. We could just dig a trench underneath the Chicago River and pipe the water further out into the lake, and then we'll just draw the nearby water. That didn't work. So they devised a different plan where they could somehow, I'm not going to get into it, some of you know the details of this and could explain it better than me, but they devised this plan to reverse the flow of the Chicago River. What if we could actually dam off the river so that all of our garbage doesn't go into the lake and just send it downstream? Then it would become St. Louis's water problem. And today, in Exodus 17, we find the people of Israel in the midst of their own water problem. So the title of today's message is The Water Problem, Part 2. So if you're just joining us, or even, I think we're second week back into the story of Exodus, let me help you get oriented to where we are and where we're going. The book of Exodus tells the story of the people of God's deliverance from Egypt. God's bringing them out. And then they journey with him on this wilderness journey into the promised land, the place of God's presence where he'd be with them. And zooming out, we're in this in-between time where God has brought them out of Egypt and brought them through the Red Sea, but they're not yet in the promised land. So we're in this in-between space, and I wonder if in this in-between, in this wilderness, you this morning feel like you're in the midst of your own wilderness season, a difficult season, a time of testing and trial. But what if, here's the question that I want to put before us this morning. What if wilderness is the rule and not the exception for the Christ follower's life? This is an idea I heard from a pastor in Richmond named Dan Murata in his book, Liturgy in the Wilderness. He challenges, what if actually all of life is lived in the wilderness, in the in-between, from this place of being saved out of slavery, delivered and brought out, and we're waiting to go home, to be with the Lord, to be in his presence fully and completely, and we live in this in-between space. All of life is lived there for a Christ follower. And maybe you wouldn't identify as a Christ follower, and that's maybe not the best teaser, come on in, the wilderness is great. But at least it's an honest appraisal of where we are. And I think what I want to take us to in the text and what the Lord has for us this morning is, what do we do when our disappointment isn't just with the trials and difficulties of life, but our disappointment is with God himself? What do we do when we're disappointed with God? So first, a test and a quarrel. If you want to look back with me at chapter 17, verses 1 and 2, all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses. They grumbled and quarreled. This is the third time we hear about, in the past 2 chapters, the Israelites grumbling. The first water problem's at the end of chapter 15, where the bitter water is turned sweet. The second grumbling was last week, where they're longing for bread and food, and they grumble. And then the third is here, but they don't just grumble, they raise a quarrel. There's an escalation of what's happening here. Why are they disappointed? I don't think it's just that they're thirsty. They've already been thirsty. The last water problem in chapter 15, there at the end in verse 27, they come to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Now they're at Rephidim, which means a resting place, and there is no water. What is God doing? Verse 1, according to the commandment of the Lord, he leads them to a resting place where there is no water. The last time the water was bitter, but at least there was 12 streams of water and 70 palm trees. Like, that sounds like a resting place. For all of you who were wearing t-shirts this week in Puerto Rico, that sounds like a resting place. Like, it's cold out here. Why are we here? Why did he bring us here? I think God did lead them to a resting place. It just wasn't the kind of rest that they thought they wanted. And so they raise a quarrel against Moses and put him to the test. They put him on trial with their complaint. And I think we can relate to this feeling of disappointment. What do we do when things aren't going like we think they ought to go? I think there's a couple of directions we could go. There's a bunch, but let me throw out a couple. One is to dream about the good old days. If we could just get back to when things were great, then everything would be fine. If we could somehow manipulate our current circumstances to be like it was then things will be great. Option 2, I didn't love how it was back then. I don't love how it is now, but I'm hopeful about this future progress, where we're headed. And if we can get enough influence to head in the direction that we want to go, then everything will be fine. Or you're dissatisfied with kind of the conservatism of the past or the progressivism of the future, and so you just escape and numb by scrolling your phone. If I can just give myself enough pleasure and distraction, then all of like this stuff will simmer down a little bit. It just doesn't ever simmer down a little bit. It actually ramps up. We live in an anxious age that is not shaping us to love God or our neighbor. We live in this in-between space, and the world around us is not helping us love God and love our neighbor in that in-between. And so we need a different way through the wilderness. I want you to look at how this conflict unfolds here for the people of Israel. They quarrel with Moses in verse 2. They demand water. Give us the water. In verse 2. They doubt and forget God's protection. He wants to kill us with thirst. Then they quarrel with Moses, but really, Moses points out, they're quarreling with God. How do we know that this was a test brought against God? Well, it's called a test twice. In verses 2 and verse 7. Why do you test the Lord in verse 2? And then in verse 7, because they tested the Lord. The Hebrew word here is the word used for a covenant lawsuit. They're saying like, hey, you didn't keep up your end of the bargain, so we're taking you to court. You haven't been taking care of us. You haven't provided for us. You're not protecting us. You're not even with us. So like, let's go to court and settle this thing. And then they list their accusations and their grievances, and they make a formal charge. He's trying to kill us. And what's the penalty for murder? The taking of a life. And so they're prepared to stone Moses because of this charge of murder that's come against them. What I think is happening here is really the nature of all kinds of conflict. When our desires become demands. It's not wrong to be thirsty, but they demand, give us water. Conflicts arise from unmet desires in our heart when we feel we cannot be satisfied unless we have something we want or think we need, and then desire turns into demand. This is Ken Sande. Conflict arises when desires grow into demands and we judge and punish those who get in our way. Conflict arises when desires grow into demands and we judge and punish those who get in our way. I think while many of our desires are not inherently sinful, our hearts are deceitful and can lead us into sin. Look at Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful. Or James chapter 1 or James chapter 4. The desires of our heart, they tempt us. They draw us towards sin. They could also draw us towards the Lord, to crying out to him, to satisfy the needs of our heart. When our desires become demands, though, we miss the opportunity to exercise our faith by asking God to meet the desires of our heart. Physical hunger invites us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. How will I ever afford to purchase a home or to live where I'm living might invite us to pray, God, provide for me, help me. Will I ever be recognized for all the work I do and all the value that I add to my job and my organization? It might invite us to actually see ourselves more in light of who God says we are than in light of what we accomplish or win. Any other number of examples I could throw out where we want things, we desire things that maybe aren't necessarily bad, but can steer us away from the Lord instead of towards him. And the invitation, I think, is open. What would it look like to take these desires and questions to the Lord? I think the Psalms give us a prayer guide. What do we do when we're disappointed with God, when we have unmet desires? How do we cry out to him, actually? So I don't have time to fully go into this, but I want to introduce the idea of lament as the prayer model of the Psalms for what we do when we're disappointed with God. And I want to contrast this example we get in Psalms of lament with how the Israelites behave in this scene, okay? So a lament begins by turning to God, crying out to him. What we see here with the people of Israel is their complaint begins by crying out to Moses. Then you voice your complaint. So in a lament, we cry out to God, then start voicing a complaint. It's not wrong to let God know, this is really bothering me. Things are not as they should be. What's going on? Where are you? How long, O Lord? Make your complaint known to him. Then a lament turns from a complaint or a plea to asking, God, how long? God, would you act on behalf of your people? God, would you intervene? Would you be with me? In the Israelites' example, they don't ask, they demand. And then a lament lands in trust, and the Israelites' example ends by testing. So a very different liturgy for how to pray to God when we're disappointed. A very different rhythm, a very different pattern. But in both cases, what we see in this text and what we see in the Psalms is that God is after our hearts. In the midst of trial and disappointment and pain, he wants our hearts. The fruit of lament is a heart that is rejoicing and renewed, even in the midst of trial. But the result of this scene in Exodus is a heart that hardens, Psalm 95 tells us. Psalm 95:7. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. When we face trials, God's ultimately after our heart, and he invites us to build trust through trial. And we exercise that trust by praying, by calling out to him, by making our complaint known, by asking him, and by landing in a place of trust. What's interesting here is that the Israelites put God on trial, and they don't realize that they are on trial. Look up at chapter 15, verse 25. Do I have the verse right? I don't know that I do. Yeah, end of verse 25. The Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them. This is the first water problem. The second problem is a food problem. Chapter 16, verse 4. Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them. Rather than take their complaints to God and ask him for help, the Israelites instead put God on the trial. So what I want to look at for a second is God in the dock. I want you to imagine a courtroom scene. The Israelites have taken the stand as judge, and God is on the dock, taking these accusations, taking the charge against himself. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his short essay, God in the Dock. This is a really absurd scene for the audience that would have read Exodus, for an ancient people who would have viewed God as judge. We are guilty, God is great. We must appease God. That's the ancient conception of who God is. Lewis says this: the ancient man approached God, or even the gods, as the accused approaches his judge. For the modern man, the roles are reversed. He is the judge, and God is in the dock. He is quite a kindly judge. If God should have a reasonable defense for being the God who permits war, poverty, and disease, he's ready to listen to it. The trial may even end in God's acquittal, but the important thing is that man is on the bench, and God is in the dock. Like the Israelites, we tend to seat ourselves in the place of judgment and then expect God to defend himself on any number of issues: gender and sexuality, money, tragedy and natural disaster, war, poverty, disease. Certainly, bring your hard questions to God. Even what we just looked at with lament, the Psalms are littered with examples of his people crying out with hard questions. He's not too small to hear our complaint or to hear our hard questions. But I want to offer two questions for us. Isn't it possible that God is even more angry when the world is not as it should be than we are? Isn't that possible? The God who made all things good, isn't it possible that he's even more angry than we are? And so the question is, are we honestly seeking answers from him, or are we simply seeking to justify our own anger and disappointment? That's a question I've been wrestling through this week. Am I honestly asking, or am I just complaining? He wants to hear both. But I think the heart he's after is the heart that really honestly seeks him. This is beautiful. Even when we don't do it right, though, God is so gracious to us. Look at how God responds. Why doesn't he just wipe them out? God, you're trying to kill us. And he's like, okay. This grumbling, angry people, they're so discontent. Every little moment when something goes wrong, they're like, I'm not here. Why doesn't he do that? That's the God I have in my imagination. He's disappointing. He's extracting. He's demanding. He's like an angry coach in my head, do better, run faster, do more. That's not the God that we see in this scene. Even though they don't bring the complaint in the right way, God even shows his grace to Moses. Look at this. Moses gets sucked into the complaints. Why did you give me this? What am I supposed to do with these people? They were thirsty, you gave them water. They were hungry, you gave them food. They're thirsty again, and now they're trying to kill me. Why did you call me here? He's actually, at this moment, he's near the place where God originally calls him. He's near the place of the burning bush where God spoke to him and said, "Go, I'm calling my people out of Egypt, and I'm sending you as a messenger to lead them." So imagine him standing there, like, "Why did you send me here? Like, you asked me right there, and like, it's not going great. They're about to kill me. Why did I even come here in the first place?" Look at God's response to both the people of Israel and to Moses in verses 5 through 6. The Lord forms a jury. Take some of the elders of Israel with you. He tells Moses to take the staff, which is the proof of his presence, and it also represents God's authority and power as judge. God's going along with it. Like, if we're having a court case today, like, let's have a court case. Jury, authority to execute judgment. Then God takes the dock. I will stand on trial. I will stand before you on the rock. Moses, this trial isn't about you. You don't have to go stand on trial. I will stand on trial. Then he receives the judgment. You will strike the rock, just as he commanded Moses to strike the Nile and turn the Nile into blood to represent judgment on the land of Egypt and on Pharaoh. And then he provides restitution, an answer to the crime. Water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. But isn't it interesting that in God asking Moses to do this, that he both sits as judge and as accused? And this is the gospel. That at the cross, God stands as both judge and accused. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, draws this out. In verse 4, he says, "For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." God answers their questions and their doubts. He brought us to a place with no water, and he reveals himself as provider and satisfies their thirst. They accuse him of getting them killed, and he reveals himself as protector by placing himself under his own judgment. They say he's not with us, he's not present with us, and he reveals his presence at the rock. And so I wonder for you, when has God proved his provision, his protection, and his presence with you in your life? Can you call to mind these moments? Maybe even like these painful moments where it's like, I was not in the right there. And yet God was gracious to me and reminded me. He'll provide for me. He'll protect me. He's with me. Our experience over the past 6 to 7 months, God has revealed his provision, his protection, and his presence with us, often through you. Like numerous, some of you are so faithful, like to shoot me a text almost every week or every week. Hey, I'm praying for you this morning. We feel that. That's a reminder to me, like God is with us, and people that we love are with us. There was one moment, unexpectedly, my family celebrated my grandfather's 90th birthday back in January of last year, and unexpectedly this summer he passed away. And he was 90, so not totally unexpected, but unexpected in terms of I was not expecting to wake up one morning and get a call from my parents like, "Hey, your grandfather passed away last night." Unbeknownst to any of you or anyone else, that happened. And I sat down at my desk that morning to start the day, and I got a phone call from Tom Oster. "Hey man, just praying for you this morning. How you doing?" Moments like that, when my heart is tempted to despair. Why are we here? Like, if I could be both places at once, I would be. Why did you call us here? And to be reminded, like, the Lord will provide. Jesus himself says, "You who left father and mother and brother, will I not give you?" Jesus, who stood at my defense, I stand justly accused. I am guilty. And yet Jesus stands unjustly accused in my place and covers me. I'll stand before you at the rock. Jesus, who was broken for me, who is the rock, who was crushed, whose life and blood flowed out for me, that I could have life and life abundant. When has God showed up for you and reminded you of his presence, his protection, and his provision for you? Call those things to mind and rejoice for the hope that's ours, even in disappointing times. What if all of life is lived in the wilderness? How then should we live in this time of waiting, in this time in between? I think we have to cling to these reminders that God is with us. God will provide for us. God will protect us. And even if that means we live a forgotten and marginalized and difficult experience as we faithfully follow him, even if it feels like we're forgotten, it is he who remembers us. It is he who rescued us.